The moment the gamma light flashed, everything changed. The room was swallowed in an intense, blinding white blue, and for a heartbeat, it felt as if time itself had stopped. Then came the wave of blistering heat, a wave that seemed to peel back the very air around us. We were trained for incidents like these, drilled with the procedures. But training does little to prepare you for the raw panic of standing in the wake of something so catastrophic, so absolute. We had been handling uranium, a volatile substance, and protocol was clear: maintain precision. But somewhere, a step had been overlooked. When Hisashi and I had mixed the solution, I remember the sudden, sickening realization that something was wrong. I felt it more than saw it. A vibration in the air, an ominous shift that brought goosebumps to my skin. Hisashi turned to me, his hand raised as if to shield himself from something only he could see. "Am I going to die?" he asked, the words hanging between us, fragile and terrifying. I didn't answer, because at that moment I couldn't. His face, already tinged with a faint burn, would haunt my dreams long after the accident. As they whisked him away, the sterile hallways of the facility became choked with murmurs. Rumors spread fast in environments like ours. Talk of botched protocols, whispers about corporate negligence. But what really terrified me were the muttered mentions of how the doctors were ordered to keep Hisashi alive for research. Watching from the narrow hallway outside the observation room, I saw him lying helpless on the hospital bed. His skin was a ghastly mosaic of burns and blisters. His body was failing, cells breaking down faster than any drug or machine could rebuild them. Every breath he took seemed to rattle in his chest, like the haunting sound of a ticking clock. We weren't allowed to visit him. The contamination risk was high. Only authorized personnel, swathed in layers of protective gear, could enter his room. But that didn't stop me from sneaking into the hallway just to catch a glimpse, to see the man who had once shared my routine and now was a walking cautionary tale. One night, after the doctors and guards had left, I slipped closer to the glass. I stood there, close enough to hear the faint hum of machines working frantically to keep him alive. His eyes opened, hollow and unfocused, yet somehow he saw me, or maybe just a shadow of who I was. And in those eyes, there was a flicker, a dying ember of recognition of a question that had never been answered. Weeks passed, each one a cruel extension of Hisashi's suffering. The doctors used words like cellular regeneration, unprecedented biological breakdown, and case study. They tried every treatment they could think of. Skin grafts, blood transfusions, experimental drugs, all while he lay there as if he were just a sample on a slide under a microscope. Some nights I'd lie awake, replaying the events in my mind, wondering where it had gone wrong. Was it an error in measurement, a failure to recognize a warning sign? Hisashi was my partner, my friend, and I had to live with the knowledge that I'd been the last person he looked at before he was engulfed by that deadly light. The media had started calling him the most radioactive man in the world. But to those of us who knew him, he was just Hisashi, a man torn apart by forces he'd trusted us to control. Each day, he was subjected to more tests, more pricks, more pain. He began to look like he was barely there, a skeleton clothed in scraps of skin, barely breathing, barely alive. And then, one day, I overheard a conversation between two doctors in the hallway. "We're close to something big," one of them said. If he can survive even a little longer, we'll learn more than we ever thought possible. They were using him. They were prolonging his suffering to scrape out every possible bit of data from his broken body, to push the boundaries of what radiation could do to a human being. But to what end? To prevent this kind of tragedy, or to perfect their methods? A chill ran down my spine as I realized that Hisashi was more valuable to them in pieces than he'd ever been whole. One night, plagued by sleeplessness, I wandered the sterile halls of the facility. I found myself again outside Hisashi's room, staring through the glass at his withered form. His breathing was labored, each rise and fall of his chest a slow, torturous rhythm. A nurse entered, silent and careful, adjusting one of the tubes. And then, almost too quietly to hear, she murmured, "I'm so sorry." I watched her place her hand on his, just for a moment. A gesture of humanity in a place that had forgotten what it meant. I wanted to scream, to demand that they end his suffering. But there was no one to scream at, only the cold, indifferent walls and the silent, methodical machinery that kept him breathing. The guilt ate at me every day. It was like a poison in my veins, making me colder, more detached. But the nightmares continued. I'd wake in a sweat, heart racing, Hisashi's blistered face staring back at me from the darkness, his hollow voice asking, "Am I going to die?" But in the dreams, I answered him, and every time the answer was the same yes. The day finally came. I'd heard whispers that Hisashi's body could no longer endure the radiation tearing through it. No longer could they ignore the breakdown, the rot. But they didn't release him out of mercy. They let him go because he was no longer of any use to them. I returned to work, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, a weight that settled deep in my bones. And I knew, no matter how many years passed, I'd never escape the shadow of what I'd witnessed. They buried what was left of him, sealed his remains in a lead-lined coffin to contain the radiation still burning within him. But the story lingered, a cautionary tale whispered among us in hushed tones.